Alright, let's go. Number 10. The Storegga submarine landslide. In 1979, geologists surveying the Norwegian continental shelf made a discovery that would take 2 decades to fully interpret. Approximately 300 kilometers offshore from Bergen, Norway, they identified a scar on the seafloor unlike anything previously mapped. The dimensions were staggering: 290 kilometers wide, 290 kilometers long, with a debris field covering 95,000 square kilometers of ocean floor. Someone had moved approximately 3,500 cubic kilometers of sediment. The question was when, and what it had done to everything living on the surface when it happened. The Storegga slide, as it came to be known, occurred approximately 8,150 years ago, during the early Holocene. The trigger was likely a combination of factors: rapid sedimentation from melting glaciers during the post-ice age warming, the release of frozen methane hydrates destabilized by rising ocean temperatures, and the weight of accumulated sediment on an already unstable slope. What happened in the minutes after the landslide began has been reconstructed from tsunami deposits found as far as the Scottish Highlands, the Faroe Islands, and Greenland. Researchers David Smith at Coventry University and Alastair Dawson published analysis in 2004 in the journal Sedimentary Geology, documenting wave heights at impact: 20 to 25 meters along the Norwegian coast, 10 to 20 meters along the Scottish coast. Wave run-up deposits found 80 kilometers inland from the Shetland Islands, 3,500 cubic kilometers of displaced sediment. To put that in context, the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens moved approximately 2.5 cubic kilometers of material. The Storegga slide moved 1,400 times that volume, in a single geological event that lasted perhaps 20 minutes. But here's where the Storegga slide becomes genuinely disturbing. 8,150 years ago, the landmass known as Doggerland, the territory connecting Britain to continental Europe, was in the final stages of being inundated by rising post-glacial seas. What remained above water was a shrinking coastal plain still inhabited by Mesolithic hunter-gatherers. The Storegga tsunami did not hit an empty coastline, it hit populated land. Analysis of the tsunami deposit layer at sites in Scotland, the Orkney Islands, and coastal Norway reveals a consistent pattern. The wave arrived suddenly and without warning. There is no archaeological record from Doggerland after this date. The communities living along those low-lying coasts left no descendants. They left a layer of marine sediment 80 centimeters thick where their settlements had been. How many people died is impossible to determine with precision. Population estimates for Northern Europe at 8,150 BP range from tens of thousands to several 100,000 individuals, scattered across what is now the North Sea Basin and surrounding coastlines. What is certain is that the Storegga tsunami eliminated entire coastal populations in regions that were already experiencing catastrophic habitat loss from rising sea levels. The Mesolithic communities that survived were driven further inland, compressed into smaller territories, forced into competition with other groups for diminishing resources. The tsunami did not just kill people. It destroyed the environmental conditions that had supported human life in the region for thousands of years. The Norwegian continental margin remains geologically active. The same sediment dynamics that produced the Storegga slide, rapid deposition, methane hydrate destabilization, slope overloading, are ongoing processes. In 2005, a team at the National Oceanography Center, Southampton, published findings in Marine Geology documenting that sediment accumulation rates on the Norwegian margin have not fundamentally changed since the Holocene. The slope is loading again. Scientists do not agree on the probability of a future failure. They do agree on one thing: the Storegga slide was not a unique event. Smaller slides have occurred in the same region before and after. The question is not whether the margin will fail again. It is whether modern infrastructure on both sides of the North Sea is built to survive the result. Number 9. The Green Sahara collapse. In 2000, satellite imagery from NASA's Shuttle Radar Topography mission revealed something beneath the sand of the Central Sahara that no living person had ever seen. River channels, hundreds of them, dried out lake beds, a drainage network covering millions of square kilometers that had once carried more water than the modern Congo River system. Geologist Nick Drake at King's College London spent years mapping the network. What he found confirmed what climate scientists had been arguing for decades. Approximately 11,000 to 5,000 years ago, the Sahara was green. And then, in geological terms, almost overnight, it died. The African humid period, as it is formally known, began approximately 11,000 years ago, when a shift in Earth's orbital cycle, specifically the precession of the equinoxes, altered the intensity of solar radiation reaching the northern hemisphere during summer months. The result was an amplified monsoon system that pushed rain deep into what is now the driest desert on Earth. Lakes formed across the central and eastern Sahara. Hippos, crocodiles, and fish populated river systems in regions that now receive less than 25 millimeters of rain per year. Human populations followed the water. Archaeological surveys conducted by Paul Sereno at the University of Chicago between 1998 and 2008 documented over 200 human settlement sites in the central Niger desert, including cemeteries containing nearly 200 individuals. Radiocarbon dating placed the burials between 7,700 and 6,200 years ago. These were communities, families, fishermen. They lived in the middle of the modern Sahara. At peak humid period conditions, the Saharan wet zone covered approximately 9 million square kilometers, an area larger than the United States. Every square kilometer that dried out took human habitat with it. But here's where the standard explanation falls apart. Mainstream models suggested the Green Sahara dried gradually, giving populations time to migrate. The paleoclimate record does not support this. Research published in 2006 by Martin Clausen at the Max Planck Institute for Meteorology, using climate model reconstructions, showed that the Sahara drying was nonlinear. It accelerated rapidly at a threshold point around 5,500 years ago. The monsoon didn't retreat slowly, it collapsed. Within centuries, possibly decades, the vegetation cover that was anchoring soil moisture disappeared. Desert conditions returned faster than human populations could adapt. The populations that had thrived across the Sahara for thousands of years had two options: move or die. Many moved. The genetic and archaeological evidence suggests massive migration flows into the Nile Valley, sub-Saharan Africa, and the coastal Maghreb in the centuries around 5000 to 4000 BP. This compression, millions of people driven from a continent-sized territory into smaller habitable zones, dramatically increased population density in places like the Nile Delta. Some researchers, including Nick Drake, have argued that this population compression was a direct driver of the early civilization building seen in Egypt and Mesopotamia. What looks like a cultural flourishing was in part the concentrated survival response to a desert that swallowed the world those people had known. The Sahara is drying again in places, but the more disturbing implication of the Green Sahara collapse isn't what it tells us about the past. It's what it tells us about thresholds. The African humid period didn't end because rainfall declined gradually to zero. It ended because vegetation cover reached a critical minimum, below which the soil stopped retaining moisture, the surface albedo changed, and the system flipped irreversibly. Climate scientists studying modern desertification in the Sahel have identified the same feedback mechanism operating today. The threshold isn't a gradual crossing, it's a cliff, and the populations living near the edge don't get a warning. Number 8. The Younger Dryas. In 1989, at the Greenland Ice Core drilling site known as GISP-2, researchers extracted a section of ice dated to approximately 12,900 years before present. What they found in the chemical record of that ice was not a gradual cooling signal. It was a wall. Within layers corresponding to perhaps a decade, possibly less, the oxygen isotope ratios shifted by an amount that represented a temperature drop of 10 to 15 degrees Celsius across the North Atlantic region. The ice core record showed that the warming trend that had been ending the last ice age simply stopped. In geological terms, it stopped instantly. The Younger Dryas event lasted from approximately 12,900 to 11,700 years ago. 1,200 years of cold that should not have happened. The most widely accepted mechanism involves the catastrophic drainage of glacial Lake Agassiz, a freshwater body that at its maximum extent covered approximately 1.5 million square kilometers of North America, larger than all of the modern Great Lakes combined. As the Laurentide ice sheet retreated, a drainage pathway opened toward the North Atlantic. The outflow, estimated by research published by Julian Merton at the University of Sussex at volumes comparable to the modern Amazon River, flooded the North Atlantic with enough freshwater to disrupt the thermohaline circulation that drives the modern Gulf Stream. Ocean circulation slowed. The warming stopped. Temperatures in the North Atlantic region reverted to near glacial conditions within decades. In 2018, a team of researchers led by Georg Schaefer at Columbia University published findings in Science showing that the Younger Dryas cooling was detectable in climate records on every inhabited continent simultaneously. The freshwater outflow from Lake Agassiz during the Younger Dryas trigger event is estimated at up to 163,000 cubic kilometers released over a period of years. That is enough freshwater to cover the entire continental United States in a layer of water 17 meters deep. But here's where the Younger Dryas becomes genuinely disturbing. In 2007, a team of 26 researchers, led by Richard Firestone at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences proposing a second mechanism. Across multiple sites in North America, Europe, and the Middle East, they identified a thin layer of material containing magnetic spherules, nanodiamonds, high-temperature fullerenes, and iridium anomalies, all consistent with extraterrestrial impact. The layer dated to the Younger Dryas boundary, 12,900 years ago. The hypothesis: a fragmenting comet struck the Laurentide ice sheet, triggering the meltwater pulse, igniting continent-wide wildfires, and simultaneously driving the megafaunal extinction. The evidence has been replicated at 52 sites across 4 continents. mainstream science has not fully accepted it. It has also not been able to refute it. The Clovis culture, the people who had colonized North America following the end of the last ice age, effectively disappeared from the archaeological record at the Younger Dryas boundary. Their distinctive stone tools appear below the boundary layer and not above it. Simultaneously, 35 genera of North American megafauna went extinct. Mammoths, mastodons, saber-toothed cats, short-faced bears, giant ground sloths, American horses, camels. Human populations in North America did not recover to pre-Younger Dryas levels for several thousand years. In Europe and Asia, the cold drove hunter-gatherer populations into southern refugia, small habitable pockets where populations compressed, resources diminished, and social pressure increased. The thermohaline circulation that the Younger Dryas disrupted is weakening again. A 2021 paper published in Nature Climate Change by Nicholas Boers at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research used statistical analysis of ocean temperature data to identify signals consistent with the circulation approaching a critical threshold. The same type of freshwater input from melting Greenland ice that triggered the Younger Dryas 12,900 years ago is now occurring from anthropogenic warming. The difference is scale and speed. The Younger Dryas meltwater pulse was a single, catastrophic drainage event. Modern Greenland melt is a sustained, accelerating process. Whether the threshold is the same is not known. What is known is that it has been crossed before. Number 7. The last glacial maximum. In 2008, a team of population geneticists led by Marcus Feldman at Stanford University published an analysis in PLOS Genetics examining the genetic diversity of 53 human populations worldwide. Their reconstruction of historical population sizes identified a severe contraction occurring between 26,000 and 19,000 years before present, precisely coinciding with the last glacial maximum. At peak glaciation, based on genetic evidence, the effective global human population was likely no more than 10,000 to 100,000 individuals. The rest of the world had become, in measurable terms, uninhabitable. At the last glacial maximum, ice sheets covered approximately 30% of Earth's land surface. The Laurentide ice sheet over North America was up to 4 kilometers thick and extended as far south as modern New York City. The Fennoscandian ice sheet covered all of Scandinavia and northern Europe. Sea levels were 120 to 135 meters lower than today, exposing continental shelves that are now submerged. Mean global temperatures were 4 to 7 degrees Celsius lower than the 20th century average, but regional temperatures near the ice sheets were 10 to 20 degrees lower. Large portions of Africa became hyper-arid desert. The Amazon basin became savanna. The forests of Southeast Asia contracted severely. Habitable land, defined as land capable of supporting human populations at Paleolithic subsistence levels, was a fraction of its current extent. The Laurentide ice sheet contained approximately 34 million cubic kilometers of ice. Melting it over the subsequent 7,000 years raised global sea levels by 120 meters, drowning all the coastal territories where the surviving human populations had concentrated. But here's where the last glacial maximum becomes genuinely disturbing. Human populations did not just contract numerically, they fragmented. Genetic analysis published by Andrea Manica at Cambridge University in 2007 in Nature identified distinct genetic lineages corresponding to isolated human refugia during the LGM, small pockets of habitable territory where separate populations survived, cut off from each other by ice, desert, and uninhabitable terrain. In Africa, the most viable refugia appears to have been along the southern coast, in what is now South Africa. In Europe, it was the Iberian Peninsula and a narrow strip along the Mediterranean. In Asia, it was isolated valleys in China and Southeast Asia. Each of these populations was evolving in isolation, under extreme resource pressure, with no contact with the others. If any one of these isolated refugia had failed, if a drought had hit the South African coast, if a late glacial advance had overrun the Iberian refugium, the lineages they carried would have ended permanently. The genetic diversity lost during the last glacial maximum bottleneck is measurable in modern populations. Populations with ancestry from regions distant from these refugia, particularly indigenous populations in the Americas and Australia, show significantly reduced genetic diversity compared to African populations, reflecting the small founder groups that survived the LGM and subsequently colonized new territories. The human species as it exists today is shaped not by an unbroken chain of thriving civilizations, but by a sequence of near extinctions, each of which eliminated lineages, cultures, languages, and accumulated knowledge that will never be recovered. The LGM was not the worst of these events. The last glacial maximum ended. The ice retreated. The sea levels rose. The habitable zones expanded. What replaced the refugia population structure was the diverse, globally distributed human species that built every civilization in the historical record. But the genetic signatures of their refugia remain embedded in modern populations, and the patterns of disease resistance, cognitive variation, and physical diversity that characterize humanity today. Everything that human beings have become was filtered through those small, isolated, freezing groups of survivors. The question that the last glacial maximum raises is not historical, it is structural. Under sufficient environmental pressure, the human species demonstrates that it will fragment into isolated pockets. Whether those pockets are capable of surviving, the pressure is never guaranteed. Number 6. The Campanian Ignimbrite Eruption. In 1978, volcanologist Giuseppe Rolandi published the first comprehensive analysis of a pyroclastic deposit found across southern Italy and the eastern Mediterranean. The deposit, a dense layer of volcanic ash and pumice with a distinctive chemical signature, had been identified at dozens of sites stretching from Italy to Russia. The chemical fingerprint matched no known historical eruption. Subsequent analysis identified the source: the Campi Flegrei volcanic system near modern Naples, Italy. The eruption that produced the deposit had occurred approximately 39,000 years ago. Researchers gradually assembled the scale. The volume of material ejected, at least 300 cubic kilometers. The VEI rating, 7. The ash dispersal footprint covered approximately 3.7 million square kilometers, an area roughly the size of the continental United States west of the Mississippi River. The Campanian Ignimbrite eruption is the largest known volcanic event in Europe during the past 200,000 years. The eruption generated pyroclastic flows, dense, fast-moving currents of superheated gas and volcanic matter that traveled up to 80 kilometers from the source. The airfall ash reached as far east as the Russian plain, north into Poland, and south across the Mediterranean into North Africa. Analysis published by Giovanni Zanchetta at the University of Pisa in the journal Quaternary International in 2018 calculated that the ash deposit created a volcanic winter effect, a sustained period of reduced solar radiation and temperature drop, lasting several years. The timing of the eruption is significant. 39,000 years ago, Europe was inhabited by both Neanderthals and early modern humans. The Neanderthal fossil record ends in the Campanian Ignimbrite ash layer, 300 cubic kilometers of ejected material. The 1991 eruption of Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines, which caused a measurable global temperature drop of 0.5 degrees Celsius for 2 years, ejected 10 cubic kilometers. The Campanian Ignimbrite eruption was 30 times larger. But here's where the standard explanation falls apart. Mainstream archaeology has attributed the Neanderthal extinction to competition with modern humans. Homo sapiens simply outcompeted them for resources and territory. The timeline does not support a simple competitive displacement. Neanderthals had survived for 400,000 years, through multiple ice ages, multiple interglacials, and tens of thousands of years of coexistence with early modern humans. The last confirmed Neanderthal sites in Europe date to approximately 40,000 to 39,000 years ago. The Campanian Ignimbrite eruption occurred at 39,000 years ago. In 2010, a team led by Clive Finlayson at the Gibraltar Museum published analysis in PLOS1, demonstrating that Neanderthal populations had already been retreating and fragmenting before the eruption. The Campanian Ignimbrite didn't cause the Neanderthal extinction, but it appears to have delivered the final blow to populations that were already critically reduced. The question mainstream archaeology has been slow to address is what this implies about modern human populations in Europe at the same time. They survived. But on what margin? The human populations of Europe at 39,000 BP were sparse. Estimates based on site density and genetic analysis suggest the effective modern human population in Europe at the time was in the hundreds to low thousands. The Campanian Ignimbrite eruption, which buried large portions of southern and eastern Europe under ash, disrupted plant and animal populations across millions of square kilometers, and triggered years of volcanic winter. Would have been an extinction-level event for any population without the geographic range and demographic buffer to absorb it. The fact that modern humans survived it in Europe is, on the numbers, not obvious. The fact that Neanderthals did not is not simply explained by cultural inferiority. The Campi Flegrei caldera system near Naples is still active. It is classified as a supervolcano. In the past decade, the ground above the caldera has been rising, a process called Briaceism, at rates not seen since the 1980s, when a previous episode of Uplift caused mass evacuations of nearby towns. Approximately 3 million people live within the potential impact zone of a major Campi Flegrei eruption. A repeat of the Campanian Ignimbrite at even half the original scale would represent the largest natural disaster in recorded human history. The monitoring is ongoing. The timeline is unknown. Number 5. The Lachant geomagnetic excursion. In 1969, geophysicists Georges Bonhomme and Jacques Babkin published an analysis of volcanic rocks collected near Lachant, a village in the Auvergne region of France. The rocks had been dated to approximately 41,000 years ago. Their magnetic orientation was wrong, not slightly off. completely reversed. The rocks were recording a geomagnetic field pointing in the opposite direction from the modern field. Subsequent analysis at sites across the globe confirmed the finding. For approximately 2,000 years, centered on 41,000 BP, the Earth's magnetic field did not merely weaken. It collapsed, and in collapsing, it removed the primary shield protecting every living organism on the surface from the full force of cosmic and solar radiation. The Lachamp excursion was first confirmed as a global event by studies published through the 1990s and 2000s. The magnetic field strength during the excursion dropped to approximately 5% of its modern intensity, the lowest level in the past 800,000 years. At such reduced field strength, the magnetosphere, the region of space dominated by Earth's magnetic field that deflects charged particles from the solar wind and cosmic rays, effectively ceased to function. Analysis published by Jean-Pierre Vallée at the Institut de Physique du Globe de Paris in 2005 in the journal Earth and Planetary Science Letters reconstructed the field strength through the excursion, using sediment cores from multiple ocean locations. The collapse was rapid, occurring over centuries, and the recovery was equally rapid. A 2021 paper by Alan Cooper at the South Australian Museum, published in Science, synthesized evidence from ice cores, cave sediments, and ancient trees to reconstruct the environmental effects. The results showed increased atmospheric radiocarbon, a signature of elevated cosmic radiation reaching the surface. The effect lasted approximately 800 years. At 5% magnetic field strength, the amount of high-energy cosmic radiation reaching Earth's surface would have increased by a factor of 3 to 5. The biological damage from ultraviolet radiation alone, with no magnetic barrier, would have been equivalent to standing several thousand feet higher in the atmosphere. For every meter of atmosphere, radiation dose increases. And during the Lachamp excursion, every living thing on Earth was effectively moved thousands of meters higher, without moving at all. But here's where the Lachamp excursion becomes genuinely disturbing. Cooper's 2021 paper identified a striking temporal correlation. The Neanderthal extinction occurred at approximately 40,000 to 42,000 BP. The Campanian ignimbrite eruption occurred at 39,000 BP. The Lachamp excursion peaked at 41,000 BP. These three catastrophic events, a geomagnetic collapse, a supervolcano eruption, and a species extinction, occurred within a window of 2,000 to 3,000 years. The paper argues that the interaction of these events, rather than any single cause, explains the Neanderthal disappearance and the severe reduction of modern human populations in Europe. The truly disturbing aspect isn't the correlation, it's what it implies. The Neanderthals survived 400,000 years. They survived ice ages, volcanic winters, and direct competition with modern humans. It took the simultaneous convergence of three Berkshire planetary scale catastrophes to end them. And modern humans were exposed to the same events. They were not protected. They simply had a slightly larger population buffer. That buffer is the only reason this list exists. The genetic record of modern human populations in Europe shows a severe bottleneck coinciding with the 40,000 to 38,000 BP period. Multiple Paleolithic archaeological sites across Europe show disruption or abandonment at this time. The Aurignacian culture, the earliest modern human culture in Europe associated with cave paintings at Chauvet and Hohlefels, shows a gap in the archaeological record during the Lachamp period. Human populations in Europe during this interval may have dropped to the hundreds, not hundreds of thousands, hundreds. The geomagnetic field is weakening again. Since 1840, when systematic measurements began, the field has weakened by approximately 9%. The South Atlantic anomaly, a region of reduced field strength over South America and the South Atlantic, has grown significantly in both size and intensity over the past several decades. NASA and ESA satellites crossing this region require additional shielding due to increased radiation exposure. Whether the current weakening represents the beginning of a new geomagnetic excursion or simply natural field variation is not known. What is known is that the Lachamp excursion required no external trigger. The field collapsed on its own, and when it did, the effects lasted 800 years. Number 4, the Toba supervolcano catastrophe. In 1998, anthropologist Stanley Ambrose at the University of Illinois published a paper in the Journal of Human Evolution that permanently changed the way scientists understood human prehistory. Ambrose was not a volcanologist. He was studying the genetic diversity of modern human populations and comparing it to populations of other great apes. The data was not making sense. Human genetic diversity was dramatically lower than it should have been for a species of our age and distribution. Lower than chimpanzees, lower than gorillas. Lower even than some localized populations of other primates. Something had happened. Something had nearly erased us. Ambrose identified the timing and matched it to a geological event that had been dated but not fully understood. The Toba eruption. 74,000 years before present. And the genetic evidence suggested that in the years following that eruption, The human species was reduced to a remnant population small enough to fit inside a single stadium. Lake Toba in Sumatra, Indonesia, is the largest volcanic lake on Earth. It occupies a caldera 100 kilometers long and 30 kilometers wide, the scar left by the most powerful volcanic eruption of the past 2 million years. The eruption occurred approximately 74,000 years ago and has been classified as a VEI-8 event, the maximum category on the Volcanic Explosivity Index. The volume of material ejected is estimated at 2,800 cubic kilometers of magma. Ash fell across South Asia in a layer up to 6 meters thick. The eruption triggered a volcanic winter estimated by climate models to have reduced global temperatures by 3 to 5 degrees Celsius for several years, with regional temperature drops in Southeast Asia and South Asia of up to 15 degrees. Research published by Ann Gibbons in Science in 1993 first proposed the connection between Toba and the human genetic bottleneck. Subsequent genetic analysis by Lynn Jord at the University of Utah and Henry Harpending, published in 2000, used mitochondrial DNA, Y chromosome, and autosomal data to independently confirm the effective human population at some point around 70,000 to 75,000 BP dropped to between 3,000 and 10,000 individuals. 2,800 cubic kilometers of ejected material. The 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora, which caused the year without a summer in 1816 and contributed to crop failures and famine across the northern hemisphere, ejected approximately 160 cubic kilometers. The Toba eruption was 17 times larger than Tambora. Tambora killed an estimated 71,000 people directly. Toba reduced the global human population to perhaps 10,000 survivors. But here's where Toba becomes genuinely disturbing. The debate in the scientific literature is not about whether the bottleneck happened. The genetic evidence for a severe population contraction at this period is robust and has been replicated across multiple independent genetic analyses. The debate is about the geography of survival. Where were the 3,000 to 10,000 people who survived? The most compelling evidence, published by Michael Petraglia at Oxford University, following excavations at sites in southern India, suggests that at least some human populations survived Toba in South Asia itself, sheltering in ecological refugia and continuing to manufacture the same stone tools before and after the ash layer. But these were not large populations. They were fragments, remnants. The genetic evidence indicates that all modern non-African humans, all 6.5 billion of them, trace their ancestry to a single population that exited Africa approximately 60,000 to 70,000 years ago, shortly after Toba. Whether that exodus was caused by the disaster pushing populations to extreme behavior, or whether it represents the survivors of a population that had already been scattered by Toba, remains unknown. What is not unknown is the implication. The entire non-African human world descends from a group that, at one point, numbered in the thousands. The African populations that survived Toba were not large either. Genetic diversity within African populations is greater than all non-African populations combined. But even African lineages show the signature of severe contraction at this period. The human species, globally, was reduced to scattered pockets of survivors, separated by environments that had been fundamentally altered by ash, cold, and ecological collapse. The cultural achievements, the languages, the accumulated knowledge of the human populations that did not survive Toba were lost permanently. We have no record of them. We have only the absence. Lake Toba is a tourist destination. It is photographed, boated, and admired from the air. Its dimensions suggest permanence. The Campi Flegrei caldera near Naples, which is actively monitored due to signs of unrest, is approximately 13 kilometers in diameter. Toba's caldera is 100 kilometers long. A repeat of the Toba eruption at equivalent scale would deposit volcanic ash across the entirety of South Asia and Southeast Asia, in a layer sufficient to collapse agriculture across the region within weeks. The volcanic winter would suppress global food production for years. Modern civilization has no contingency plan for a VEI-8 event. The closest analog, Toba itself, reduced the human species to a population that fit inside a gymnasium. The gymnasium is gone, the lake is still there. Number 3, the first out of Africa extinction. In 2015, anthropologist Israel Hershkovitz at Tel Aviv University was examining human fossils recovered from Mislia Cave on the slopes of Mount Carmel in northern Israel. The fossils were anatomically modern Homo sapiens. The dating was unexpected. Uranium, thorium, and electron spin resonance analysis returned a date range of 177,000 to 194,000 years ago. Modern humans in the Levant nearly 200,000 years before the migrations that produced all living non-African humans. These were not ancestors of anyone alive today. They were the pioneers of a first exodus that left no surviving descendants. An entire expansion of the human species into Eurasia that was erased so completely it left no genetic trace in any modern population on Earth. The evidence for what researchers call the earlier dispersal of modern humans from Africa has been accumulating since the 1990s. Fossil sites at Kafza and School Caves in Israel contain anatomically modern human remains dated to 90,000 to 120,000 years ago. The Mislia fossil pushes that boundary further, to nearly 200,000 BP. In 2018, a team led by Katerina Doka at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology published revised dates for the Bacho Kiro cave site in Bulgaria, finding modern human remains dated to approximately 45,000 BP that carried Neanderthal ancestry from recent interbreeding, suggesting early modern humans had been mixing with Neanderthals in Europe before the main migration wave. But the critical finding is in the genetics. The comprehensive analysis of ancient DNA from sites across Eurasia, synthesized by David Reich at Harvard Medical School and published in his 2018 work, Who We Are and How We Got Here, is unambiguous. All living non-African humans trace their ancestry to a single migration out of Africa that occurred approximately 60,000 to 70,000 years ago. The earlier populations left no surviving lineages. A population capable of reaching the Levant from East Africa 177,000 to 194,000 years ago, and establishing itself well enough to die there in sufficient numbers to leave fossil remains, was not a small group. These were people with language, technology, social organization, and the capacity to survive migration across thousands of kilometers of unfamiliar terrain. Whatever erased them erased not just individuals, but everything they had learned. But here's where the first exodus becomes genuinely disturbing. We do not know what ended them. The leading hypotheses include resurgent archaic human populations, climate deterioration during the glacial intensification that began approximately 130,000 years ago, epidemic disease, ecological collapse of the Levantine corridor, or some combination of factors too complex to reconstruct from fossil evidence. The truly disturbing aspect isn't what killed the first exodus, it's the pattern it reveals. Modern humans did not emerge from Africa once, spread globally, and survive. They emerged, were erased, emerged again, were erased again, and the group that finally survived, the ancestors of all living non-African people, did so not through superiority, but through timing. They left Africa approximately 60,000 to 70,000 years ago, shortly after Toba had cleared ecological competition and opened migration corridors. They were not the best equipped human population to spread across the world. They were the last ones left. The people of the first exodus left no descendants. Their fossils have been found in Israel and possibly at sites in China and Southeast Asia that have been the subject of ongoing dating controversies. Their stone tools have been identified at sites across the Arabian Peninsula, India, and East Asia. They existed, they built, they traveled. And then at some point between 120,000 and 70,000 years ago, they died. Every single lineage, in every location they had reached. The extinction was not local. It was global in scope, affecting every population of modern humans outside Africa. Whatever ended them ended simultaneously, or in close enough succession, to leave no surviving lineages anywhere. No modern genetic study has found a trace of their contribution to any living human genome. The first exodus was not a unique event, it was a pattern. Homo sapiens has repeatedly demonstrated the capacity to expand out of Africa and then collapse. The migration that produced all living non-African humans succeeded not because those people were fundamentally different from the ones who came before. They succeeded because the conditions happened to align, because Toba had reshuffled the ecological deck, because the climate window was right, because a few thousand people in a specific location managed to avoid whatever had ended their predecessors. The difference between the lineages that survived and the ones that didn't is not visible in the fossil record. That is the most disturbing implication of the first exodus. We have no idea why some groups survived and others didn't. We only know which side we're on. Number 2, the marine isotope stage 6, glaciation, and African refuge. In 1987, a landmark paper published in Nature by Rebecca Cann, Mark Stoneking, and Alan Wilson at the University of California, Berkeley, analyzed mitochondrial DNA from 147 people, representing 5 major geographic groups. Their analysis traced all human mitochondrial lineages back to a single common ancestor, a woman who lived in Africa approximately 155,000 years ago. She has been referred to in subsequent literature as mitochondrial Eve. What the paper's authors were careful to note, but what subsequent reporting often omitted, is what this finding implies. At some point, around 155,000 to 200,000 years ago, the mitochondrial lineages of all other contemporary women died out, not through any dramatic event visible in the fossil record, through the quiet arithmetic of extinction, lineages that produced no surviving female descendants, over and over, until only one remained. Something was driving that extinction, and the climate record of 195,000 to 130,000 years ago, covering a period known as marine isotope stage 6, suggests what it was. Marine isotope stage 6 was the penultimate glacial period, the ice age before the last ice age. At its maximum extent, approximately 160,000 to 145,000 years ago, MIS 6 was colder and more severe than the last glacial maximum that followed it. Sea levels dropped by at least 120 meters. Mean global temperatures were 5 to 7 degrees Celsius below the 20th century average. In Africa, the effects were catastrophic. Reconstruction of African paleoclimate during MIS 6, published by Peter Domenical at Columbia University's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory in 2004 in the journal Earth and Planetary Science Letters, identified severe aridification across much of the continent. Across the Sahara expanded, equatorial forests contracted, major river systems dried. Research published by Curtis Marion at Arizona State University in 2007 in Nature documented what appears to be a survival refuge for modern humans at Pinnacle Point, a coastal site on the southern tip of Africa. The site contains evidence of shellfish harvesting, heat-treated silkrete tools, and ochre, used dating to approximately 164,000 to 75,000 BP, precisely spanning the MIS 6 glaciation and its aftermath. The population living at Pinnacle Point was exploiting coastal resources, shellfish, marine mammals, estuarine fish, that were unavailable to inland populations. They were surviving on the edge of a continent that was, in most places, becoming unsurvivable. The habitable zone for modern humans during MIS 6 peak conditions may have been as small as 1,000 to 2,000 kilometers of southern African coastline, an area smaller than the coast of California. That is where our species survived. What makes MIS 6 particularly disturbing isn't its scale, it's its duration. The last glacial maximum lasted approximately 7,500 years at peak intensity. MIS 6 lasted approximately 50,000 years. For 50,000 years, the conditions that allowed human life across most of Africa were absent. For 50,000 years, the populations of Homo sapiens outside the southern African refuge were being progressively eliminated, not by a single catastrophe, but by the slow and total replacement of habitat with desert, cold, and absence of food. The mitochondrial clock indicates that the diversity loss during this period was extreme. All lineages tracing to women who lived outside the refuge during MIS 6 are gone. Every person alive today descends from the survivors of that coastline. The population living at Pinnacle Point and the small cluster of comparable sites along the southern African coast was genetically small. The effective population size during MIS 6 peak has been estimated at between 1,000 and 10,000 individuals. These were the last of our kind. Every other population of Homo sapiens on Earth, the groups who had already reached the Levant, possibly China, possibly Southeast Asia, was being eliminated by conditions that the coastal refuge population survived only by changing their diet, their technology, and their relationship to the ocean. The behavioral modernity that archaeologists attribute to the African Middle Stone Age, symbolic ochre, complex tools, evidence of planning and abstraction, appears in this period. It did not emerge because these people were advanced. It emerged because they were desperate. Every person alive today, every person who has ever lived in the past 100,000 years, exists because a small group of humans living on a narrow strip of African coastline 160,000 years ago had access to shellfish. That is not a metaphor. It is a measurable fact embedded in every human genome. The diversity of all living humans, the genetic variation that produces every physical and cognitive characteristic that distinguishes one person from another, was filtered through those survivors. What was lost during MIS 6 was not just population numbers. It was the accumulated genetic and cultural variation of all the other Homo sapiens lineages that had existed before. We are not the inheritors of the full human experiment. We are the descendants of one coastal fragment of it. Number 1, the 900,000-year bottleneck. In July 2023, a team of population geneticists led by Wang Hu at Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai published a paper in the journal Science that recalibrated the understanding of human prehistory in a way that most subsequent coverage failed to fully convey. The team had developed a new analytical method called FitCol for fast infinitesimal time coalescent, capable of detecting ancient population sizes from modern genetic data with greater precision than previous models. They applied it to the complete genomic sequences of 3,154 individuals, representing 10 African and 40 non-African populations. What they found predated Toba. It predated the MIS 6 glaciation. It predated the emergence of anatomically modern Homo sapiens. Approximately 930,000 years ago, the ancestral population of all living humans nearly ceased to exist. And that near extinction lasted for 100 older 17,000 years. The fit coal analysis identified a population bottleneck beginning approximately 930,000 years ago and ending approximately 813,000 years ago, a period corresponding to the transition from early Pleistocene to Middle Pleistocene, known in the paleoclimate record as the Mid-Pleistocene transition. During this transition, ice age cycles shifted from 41,000-year periodicity to 100,000-year periodicity, becoming longer, more severe, and less predictable. The effective breeding population of the ancestral human lineage during this bottleneck was approximately 1,280 individuals. Total population, accounting for standard effective to census population ratios, has been estimated at approximately 8,000 to 16,000 individuals. The bottleneck lasted 117,000 years. During this period, the paper calculates, approximately 65.85% of ancestral human genetic diversity was permanently lost, not reduced, lost, gone from the human lineage forever. 1,280 breeding individuals. The genetic effective population of modern chimpanzees is approximately 21,000. The effective population of modern gorillas is approximately 25,000. At the peak of the 900,000-year bottleneck, the ancestral population of all living humans was smaller in effective breeding terms than a single localized population of modern bonobos. The margin between that population and zero was not wide. But here's where the 900,000-year bottleneck becomes genuinely disturbing. The period it covers, 930,000 to 813,000 BP, corresponds exactly to the gap that paleontologists have long noted in the human fossil record. Almost no hominin fossils have been found from this period anywhere in the world. For 117,000 years, the ancestral human lineage left almost no physical trace. This has been attributed to poor preservation conditions, sampling bias, or the limitations of the fossil record. The fit coal analysis suggests a third explanation. There were almost no individuals alive to leave a record. The implication is not merely that the human population was small. It is that the fossil record gap, which paleontologists have puzzled over for decades, may simply reflect the arithmetic of near extinction. When a species drops to 1,280 breeding individuals distributed across a continent or more, the probability of any individual dying in a location, at a depth, under conditions that permit fossilization and later discovery approaches zero. We cannot find them because there were almost none of them to find. The species that survived the 900,000-year bottleneck was not Homo sapiens. Anatomically, modern humans did not emerge until approximately 300,000 years ago. The survivors of the bottleneck were a pre-sapiens hominin, variously categorized in different analyses as late Homo erectus or an unclassified Middle Pleistocene human. What makes this number disturbing is not what was lost, it is what was preserved. The 1,280 breeding individuals who carried the human lineage through 117,000 years of whatever caused that bottleneck were carrying something they could not have known they were carrying. The entire genetic foundation of every human being who would ever live. Every human language, every human civilization. Every work of art, science, philosophy, and violence in the human record traces its biological origin to that group. They did not know they were the last. They were simply surviving. And for 117,000 years, barely doing that. The cause of the 900,000-year bottleneck has not been identified. The mid-Pleistocene transition is the most commonly proposed driver, but the mechanism by which changing ice age periodicity reduced a continental hominin population to 1,280 breeding individuals for over 100,000 years has not been established. The truly disturbing aspect isn't what caused it, it's what it implies about the frequency of near extinction in the human lineage. Before the bottleneck, unknown population. During, 1,280 breeders for 117,000 years. After, slow recovery. Toba at 74,000 BP, reduction to 3,000 to 10,000 again. MIS 6 at 160,000 BP, reduction to a coastal remnant. First exodus, total erasure of non-African populations. The pattern that emerges from the cumulative genetic record is not a story of human resilience. It is a story of repeated near elimination. The question the 900,000-year bottleneck raises is not whether the human species has the capacity to nearly go extinct. It has done so multiple times. The question is whether the mechanisms capable of driving it to the edge, climate, volcanism, geomagnetic failure, unknown causes, are less present now than they were then. They are not. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.